Throughout history, women have suffered some of the most brutal and cruel punishments imaginable. Many of these punishments were designed to silence, control, and terrorize them. From medieval torture devices to public humiliations, these punishments were not just about justice. They were about power, fear, and oppression. But here's the shocking part. Some of these punishments weren't just ancient horrors. Some were still used until very recently. And in some parts of the world, women still face unjust cruelty today. So, what were these horrifying punishments? Why were they used? And how did they shape the lives of women through history? Stay with me until the end, because you won't believe the cruelty that was considered normal in the past. Now, let's begin. Punishment has always existed in society. Laws, justice systems, and rulers have decided what is right and wrong, and those who break the rules often suffer consequences. But for women, punishment was often different. It wasn't always about crime. It was about obedience. Many times, women were punished simply for being outspoken, for challenging authority, or even for things beyond their control, like being accused of witchcraft. Throughout different cultures and time periods, the methods of punishment changed, but the cruelty remained the same. Today, we'll explore some of the most horrifying ways women were punished throughout history. 1. The scold's bridle, silencing women. One of the most infamous punishments used on women was the scold's bridle. This device was used from the 16th to the 19th century, mainly in England and Scotland. It was a metal mask that locked onto a woman's head, covering her mouth with a piece of iron or spike metal. Why was this used? Because women who spoke too much, gossiped, or argued with men were labeled as scolds. In those times, a woman's role was to be silent and obedient, and those who dared to express opinions were seen as a problem. Wearing the scold's bridle wasn't just painful, it was humiliating. Women were often paraded through town, forced to wear the device while people laughed, spat, or threw things at them. The emotional and physical pain was meant to break their spirit and teach other women a lesson. Stay silent or suffer the consequences. 2. Witch trials, the cruelest accusations. Perhaps one of the most terrifying punishments in history was being accused of witchcraft. The witch hunts of the 15th to 18th centuries led to the execution of thousands of innocent women. Women were accused of being witches for absurd reasons. If someone's crops failed, if a cow stopped giving milk, or if a woman was simply disliked, she could be blamed. These accusations often came from jealous neighbors, rival families, or even men who wanted to get rid of a woman who refused them. The punishments were brutal. Drowning tests. A woman was thrown into a river with her hands tied. If she floated, she was guilty and burned at the stake. If she sank and drowned, she was innocent, but dead, burning at the stake. In many European countries, accused witches were burned alive in public. Hanging. In places like England and America, accused witches were hanged after unfair trials. Torture. Before execution, women were often tortured into confessing. Devices like thumbscrews, the rack, and even hot irons were used to make them admit to crimes they never committed. The witch hunts were nothing more than an excuse to control women. They targeted midwives, healers, widows, and independent women, those who didn't fit the mold of a quiet, obedient wife. 3. Footbinding, a life of pain in China. In China, from the 10th to the early 20th century, young girls were subjected to a horrific practice known as footbinding. Wealthy families forced their daughters to have their feet tightly wrapped in bandages to stop them from growing. The bones were broken, reshaped, and forced into tiny, painful positions. Why? Because small feet, known as lotus feet, were seen as beautiful and a sign of high status. Men preferred women with tiny feet, believing they were more delicate and obedient. The pain was unbearable. Girls as young as 5 had their feet crushed, and infections were common. Many couldn't walk properly for the rest of their lives. But despite the suffering, footbinding continued for centuries because society believed that a woman's beauty was more important than her health. For the chastity belt, a life of control. The chastity belt is one of the most bizarre punishments women faced. It was a metal device locked around a woman's waist, covering her private parts, making it impossible for her to have any sexual contact. It was believed that men, especially knights who went to war, used chastity belts to protect their wives from being unfaithful. But in reality, many women were forced to wear them to control their freedom. The belt was uncomfortable, painful, and dangerous. Women could suffer infections, injuries, and even death from wearing them too long. Some were so tight that they cut into the skin, causing permanent damage. This was not about protection. It was about ownership. Women were seen as property, and their bodies were controlled by men. 5. The ducking stool, a public torture. In medieval Europe, women accused of gossiping, nagging, or even being witches were subjected to the ducking stool. This was a wooden chair attached to a long beam, placed over a river or pond. The woman was tied to the chair and repeatedly dunked into the water. The punishment was humiliating, terrifying, and often deadly. Some women drowned from being held under too long. Others were left with permanent injuries from the shock of freezing water. This was another way to silence women, to scare them into obedience, and to make an example of them. 6. Honor killings, a practice that still exists. Not all horrifying punishments are from the past. Honor killings still happen in some parts of the world today. Women are killed by their own family for things like refusing an arranged marriage, being seen with a man, or even being a victim of assault. The logic behind this is horrifying. Families believe that a woman's actions can bring shame, and the only way to restore honor is through violence. These crimes are often ignored or lightly punished, showing that even in modern times, many societies still view women as less valuable than men. History is filled with dark chapters, and the punishments women faced are some of the most horrifying examples of cruelty, oppression, and injustice. When we look back at these punishments, from the scold's bridle and the ducking stool to witch trials and footbinding, it's easy to feel shocked, even disgusted. How could societies justify such brutality? How could so many people stand by and let innocent women suffer? But here's the most unsettling part. These punishments weren't just random acts of violence. They were systems of control. They were tools used by societies, governments, and even families to make sure women stayed in their place, to keep them quiet, obedient, and powerless. The more we examine history, the more we realize that these punishments were not about justice. They were about fear. They were about punishing women who dared to speak out, who dared to be different, who dared to challenge the idea that they existed only to serve men. Women who were independent, outspoken, intelligent, or simply unlucky often became victims of these cruel practices. And while we may think that these punishments are relics of the past, the reality is far more disturbing. Some of these practices continue for centuries. Some, in different forms, still exist today. Take honor killings, for example. While most of the world has moved away from public executions and extreme physical punishments, women in certain parts of the world are still murdered for bringing shame to their families. Some are killed for refusing a forced marriage. Others are punished simply for being seen with a man who isn't their husband. The methods have changed, but the mindset remains the same. Even in so-called modern societies, traces of these historical punishments can still be found. Women are still judged harshly for speaking their minds. They are still blamed for their own suffering. They are still expected to conform to outdated standards of behavior. In many places, women are not physically tortured, but they face economic, legal, and social punishments that limit their freedom. So what does this all mean for us today? It means that history isn't just something we read about in books. It's something that still shapes the world we live in. By studying these punishments, we can see how far we've come, but also how far we still have to go. The world has made progress, but the battle for equality and justice is far from over. It also means that we have a responsibility. We cannot change the past, but we can learn from it. We can challenge outdated beliefs, fight against injustice, and speak up for those who are still suffering. When we remember the women who were tortured, humiliated, and killed, we honor them not by pitying them, but by making sure that history does not repeat itself. We also need to recognize the strength of the women who came before us. Despite the punishments, despite the oppression, women throughout history have continued to resist, to fight back, and to demand change. They have challenged unfair laws, fought for their rights, and refused to be silenced. Their courage is the reason we live in a world where women have more freedom today. But freedom is not guaranteed. Rights can be taken away. Justice can be reversed. And that is why it is so important to know history, because those who don't remember the past are doomed to repeat it. So as we end this discussion, I leave you with a question. How do we make sure that these horrifying punishments stay in the past? If you found this video thought-provoking, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more deep dives into history's forgotten truths. And let me know in the comments which punishment shocked you the most. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay aware.